I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the other two works you were assigned for today. Hagia Sophia has a way of using up the available oxygen. I also don't plan to repeat all of the information from your Khan Academy homework, but let me make just a few points. You need to know the term illuminated manuscript. Illuminated really just means illustrated, but why was this work also luminous or light-filled? Well, the writing was in silver, so it would have gleamed. A heavy use of gold, silver, and other precious metals is characteristic of Byzantine work. You've encountered continuous narratives before. Think of the Last Judgment of Hunnifer. This is one of the ways that artists solve the problem of choosing which part of a narrative to tell. They just don't choose. What are the more classical characteristics of this work, which is a transitional work between Roman early Christian art and Byzantine art? Yup, there are bodies under those clothes. We also see classical architecture and that rather intriguing twisted bridge. Finally, the frieze structure itself suggests classical narrative. Think of Trajan's column. This image makes the continuous narrative clearer. All the figures I've circled in green are Jacob. I think this comparison makes the contrast between classical and Byzantine style even clearer. In the portrait of Justinian and his attendants, the body shape is pretty much indiscernible. There is no real sense of movement. The figures are stiff and fully frontal, very heavily dependent on line. And while the figures do overlap, there's really no sense of depth. On the other hand, the Jacob frieze lacks perspective, so while the figures are modeled, the scene is still essentially flat. In other words, this work contains both classical and Byzantine elements. Here's the second required image from the Vienna Genesis. Again, we see continuous narrative, Rebecca coming to the wall, and just below her, meeting with Jacob's servant and chosen representative, Eliezer. We also see a number of classical elements, which I've circled. What are they? Well, most obviously, the sexy lady by the spring appears to be a water nymph, or at least a personification of the well. A little out of place, wouldn't you think, in a Christian book, and evidence that pagan images would persist well into the Christian era. Personifying elements of nature was part of the classical tradition. Note, too, the Greco-Roman colonnades along Rebecca's path and the shading and modeling on the camels, which gives them a sense of depth that contrasts with the flatness of later Byzantine art. What makes the walled city, circled in green, a more Byzantine or medieval image? It is fortified, for one. These are now more dangerous times. Pax Romana is history. But the building also lacks proper perspective. It seems to be floating in the air. So let's play detective. Why do you think the College Board included these works? One answer is pretty straightforward. This is the oldest surviving, well-preserved, illustrated biblical book. I think the other reason is that the illustrations so clearly show evidence of a transition between classical and Byzantine style. Our history textbooks divide periods into neat categories. Real life and art seldom divides up quite so easily into these tidy categories. These aren't required works, but I thought you'd be interested in seeing more images from the same text. While the narratives show movement, the figures again seem rather stiff and stylized, although still somewhat more naturalistic than the mosaics. You've been looking at Byzantine images for an entire class period. You've also learned more about iconoclasm, a subject that fascinates the College Board and might very well show up on your test. It certainly has in the past. If there's any time left, I'd like you to close by talking about what ties this icon to the classical world that was fading away and what reveals an especially Byzantine worldview. Think especially about facial expressions and the position of the bodies in space. I love Byzantine art and regret that we're rushing it through quickly, although we have lingered on Hagia Sophia. I just note, by the way, that this work shows up very frequently on AP exams from the new curriculum. So just the fact that I'm going through it quickly doesn't mean that you can afford to skip your homework on this one. Hope you didn't. I'm going to close on a sadder note. Hagia Sophia ended its career as a Christian church in a bloodbath. Some reports eyewitness reports say that blood ran as much as 6 inches thick through the cathedral because Byzantine Christians had fled there hoping they would be safe. They were not. So here is one eyewitness account. When there was no longer any resistance, the enraged Turkish soldiers roamed through the town, stealing, disrobing, pillaging, killing, raping, taking captive men, women, and children, old men, young men, monks, priests, people of all sorts and conditions. Temples were ransacked and pillaged. Sacred objects were scornfully flung aside. The holy icons and the holy vessels were desecrated. Ornaments were burned, broken into pieces, or simply thrown into the streets. When Mehmet the Conqueror saw all that had perished and become ruins, a great sadness took possession of him, and he repented the pillage and all the destruction.